Everyone treats Rick Sanchez like a reckless drunk who ruins every room he enters. His family blames him first. The fandom laughs him off as pure chaos, with no real judgment behind it. 10 separate episodes tell a very different story. In this video, we break down every moment where Rick Sanchez turned out to be the only person in the room who was actually right. Section 01. The Therapy Warning. Rick Sanchez turns himself into a pickle to avoid 1 hour of family counseling, and it costs him a trip through a sewer, a small war inside a foreign spy building, and a fight with a professional killer. By the time he walks back into the room where his family is waiting, he looks like he survived something out of a war movie. The strange part is that everything he said about therapy before any of that happened turns out to hold up. He said he did not respect it. He said it would not help him. He said the people who go are usually just looking for comfort, not answers. None of that gets disproven by the end of the episode. If anything, the fight through the sewer and the embassy just prove how far Rick will go to avoid sitting in a room and talking about his feelings, which was exactly his point from the start. The episode is called Pickle Rick, and it aired in August of 2017 as the 3rd episode of Season 3. It was written by Jessica Gao and directed by Anthony Chun. It later won the show its first Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program. The setup is simple. Beth, Morty, and Summer are supposed to go to a family counseling session together. Rick is supposed to go too, but on the morning of the appointment, he shows Morty that he has turned himself into a pickle sitting on a shelf in the garage. Morty is horrified and confused, and asks him why he would do something like this. Rick brushes him off and makes it clear that becoming a pickle was simply something to do, and that going to therapy was never something he was going to consider. Before any of the chaos in the sewer starts, it is worth slowing down on what Rick actually says about therapy, because his reasoning is the whole engine of the episode. He tells Morty that he does not respect therapy because he is a scientist, someone who builds, changes, and destroys things for a living. When something bothers him about the world, his instinct is to go fix it directly, not talk about how it makes him feel. He says that sitting in an office and having someone explain which words match which feelings has never actually helped a person do anything. He admits it probably helps people calm down and feel comfortable, but he says that is the kind of comfort you give an animal you are trying to keep calm before slaughter, and that he refuses to be treated like livestock. He is blunt about it. He would rather be a vegetable that argues with people than a calm animal that gets managed. This is where the episode starts building its case for Rick. His logic is arrogant and cold, but it is also consistent. He is not avoiding therapy because he is scared of it in a normal sense. He is avoiding it because his entire identity is built around control, around being the one person in any room who can act instead of just talk. Going to a stranger's office and admitting that his mind might need outside help would mean giving up the one thing he trusts completely, which is his own judgment. That is not a small fear. That is the core of who he is. And through the entire episode, everything that happens seems to be testing whether that fear is justified. Once Rick is left alone in the garage as a pickle, the family cat knocks him off the shelf. He rolls out into the driveway and gets washed by the rain straight into a street drain, dropping him into the sewer system underneath the house. This is the point where the episode stops treating the pickle idea as a joke and starts treating it as a survival problem. A pickle has no arms, no legs, and no way to defend itself. Most people would assume this is where Rick's plan falls apart completely. Instead, he starts working with what is around him. He kills a cockroach and uses its head and nervous system to build himself a small moving body, giving himself the ability to crawl and grab things for the first time since the transformation. From there, things escalate fast. The tiny cockroach body Rick has built lets him move through the sewer, but the sewer is full of rats, and the rats do not appreciate an armored pickle with a bug head crawling through their territory. Rick ends up fighting the biggest and toughest rat in the tunnel system, killing it, and then using pieces of the rat's own bodies to build himself an even bigger, sturdier suit. This whole sequence plays out like an action movie fight scene, except the hero is a vegetable using dead rodents as spare parts. It sounds ridiculous written out, and it is, but it is also the clearest demonstration in the entire episode of exactly what Rick told Morty at the start. He said he changes the world when he does not like something about it. He said he invents and destroys for a living. Being turned into a pickle and dropped into a sewer would stop almost anyone else on the planet, It does not stop him, it barely slows him down. After clearing the rats, Rick uses a set of small rockets he built into his rat suit to launch himself through the sewer pipe and out through a toilet. That toilet happens to be inside a building that turns out to be a foreign government agency, something like an embassy for a country that resembles Russia. Guards who speak Russian spot him immediately and start shooting. Being shot at while trapped inside a rat body would be the end for most creatures. Rick instead runs into a nearby room and starts building weapons out of whatever office supplies he can find. Within a short amount of time, he is setting traps, building explosives, and using a laser cutter to fight off armed men twice his size, despite being, underneath all of it, a pickle riding around inside a suit made of dead animal parts. The head of the agency, a director named Pavel Bartek, realizes that ordinary guards are not going to be enough to stop whatever is tearing through his building. He calls in a prisoner the agency has been holding, a hardened fighter named Jaguar, voiced by Danny Trejo. The deal is that if Jaguar defeats the strange creature causing all the damage, his daughter will be released. Jaguar and Rick end up in a brutal one-on-one fight, evenly matched enough that the fight itself becomes a genuine showdown rather than a quick win for either side. At some point during the fighting, both of them stop trying to kill each other and start talking instead, and Rick figures out that the agency likely never intended to release Jaguar's daughter at all. Once Jaguar realizes this too, the two of them stop being enemies and become allies, working together to escape the building and burn it down behind them. By the time Rick makes it out of that building, he has fought a small army of armed guards, a professional killer, and an entire population of sewer rats, using nothing but a rat corpse suit and a pickle's worth of intelligence. None of this was necessary. He could have simply gone to therapy that morning. Every single fight, every explosion, every drop of fake blood on screen exists because Rick decided that risking his life in a war zone was still a better option than sitting in a chair and talking about his feelings for 1 hour. That is either the most extreme avoidance behavior imaginable, or it is proof that Rick meant exactly what he said about himself from the very beginning of the episode. While all of this is happening underground and inside a spy agency, the other half of the episode is following Beth, Morty, and Summer as they sit through their actual therapy session with Dr. Wong, played by Susan Sarandon. Without Rick there to dominate the room, the session ends up focusing heavily on Beth herself, particularly on how much she idolizes her father and how that idolization has shaped the way she raises her own kids. Morty and Summer start to realize, almost by accident, just how much their mother's view of Rick as some kind of untouchable genius has affected the entire family's ability to talk honestly about anything. It is a quieter, slower plot compared to the chaos happening with Rick, but it sets up the final confrontation perfectly, because it shows exactly how deep this family's habit of avoiding hard conversations really goes. Eventually, battered, stitched up, and looking like he has been through a war, because he has, Rick walks into the therapy office to get the antidote that will turn him back into a human. He acts like nothing happened. Dr. Wong does not react with shock or panic at the sight of a beat-up pickle walking and covered in wounds. Instead, she calmly starts to lay out exactly what she has figured out about him during the session, based entirely on what his family has told her and on the simple fact that he chose to become a vegetable rather than sit in her office. Her read on him is sharp. She tells him that the only real connection between his obvious intelligence and the dysfunction hurting his family is that everyone in that family, himself included, uses intelligence as an excuse to avoid dealing with what is actually wrong. She points out that he treats his own mind as either an unstoppable weapon or an unbearable curse, and that the one idea he can never seem to accept is that his mind is something he actually has control over. She reminds him that he chose to come to her office, chose to talk, chose to insult her profession, the exact same way he chose to turn himself into a pickle in the first place. She tells him, bluntly, that he may be the master of his own universe, but right now he is covered in rat blood and human waste, and his enormous brain is rotting away by his own choice. She adds that she has no doubt therapy would bore him completely, the same way she is bored brushing her teeth or cleaning up after herself, because those tasks are not adventures. There is no way to do them so wrong that you might die. They are just quiet, ordinary work, and some people are fine doing that kind of work, while other people, according to her, would rather die first. It is one of the most direct character studies the show ever gives Rick, and it lands because it does not try to make him a monster or a hero. It simply describes him honestly, And here's the detail that matters most for figuring out whether Rick was actually right in this episode. Nothing Dr. Wong says contradicts what Rick told Morty at the start. She is not proving him wrong about therapy not working for him. She is explaining why he feels that way, and her explanation actually backs up his own reasoning rather than tearing it apart. Rick said he is not built for a slow, careful process of talking through feelings. Dr. Wong essentially agrees, just from a therapist's point of view instead of Rick's own. She is diagnosing him accurately, but the diagnosis confirms his self-awareness rather than exposing some hidden flaw in his logic. After the session ends, Dr. Wong hands the family her card and, almost as a parting joke, tells them that if they know anyone else who eats out of the trash, the way Rick apparently just implied he does, they are welcome to call her too. On the drive home, Pickle Rick apologizes to Beth for lying about the real reason he skipped the session, and Beth brushes it off, more relieved that he is safe than upset that he lied. The two of them end up laughing together about the actual reasons Morty and Summer were originally supposed to be in therapy in the first place, which involved Morty wetting himself and Summer inhaling nail polish fumes, two much smaller problems that got completely buried under the spectacle of Rick's pickle adventure. Morty and Summer, sitting in the back seat, start to realize just how far their mother and grandfather will go to avoid looking at themselves honestly, and how comfortable the two of them are mocking the very session that was supposed to help all of them. What makes this episode worth building an entire section around, for a video about times Rick was actually right, is that his correctness here is not about winning a fight or solving a scientific problem. It is about self-knowledge. Rick knew exactly what kind of person he was before any of the sewer chaos happened. He told Morty flatly that talking about feelings in an office was never going to work for him, and that he would rather face nearly certain death than sit through it. Everything that follows, the rats, the guards, the fight with Jaguar, the destruction of an entire foreign agency building, exists purely to prove that statement true in the most extreme way the show could possibly stage it. Even the therapist, the one person in the episode whose entire job is to challenge his thinking, ends up confirming his self-assessment instead of dismantling it. There is also something worth noting about how the show frames the ending. Rick does not walk away from this episode having learned some big lesson about opening up emotionally. He walks away laughing with Beth in the car, mocking the process that was supposed to help fix things, completely unchanged by everything he just went through. Some viewers read that as the show criticizing Rick, showing how he wastes his own insight by refusing to grow. Other viewers read it as the show simply being honest about him, refusing to pretend that a single dramatic day would suddenly turn a man like Rick into someone who suddenly wants to work on himself. Either way, the core fact remains the same. He said something true about who he is, and nothing in the episode, not the danger, not the therapist's speech, not his own family's reaction, proves that statement wrong. There is a strange kind of consistency running underneath all the blood and explosions in this episode, and it says something bigger about how Rick operates across the entire show. He rarely lies about what he is capable of, and he rarely lies about what he is not willing to do. He told Morty, without hesitation, that he was not going to sit in that office. He was right about that from the very first minute of the episode to the very last. The only question left is whether being right about avoiding your problems is actually a victory, or whether it just means you have gotten extremely good at running in the opposite direction. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That question about running instead of facing something head-on becomes a lot more complicated once memory gets involved, when an entire family stops being able to trust what is even real inside their own house, and one member of that family turns out to be the only one paying close enough attention to notice something everyone else missed completely. Section 02. The Parasite Call. Rick Sanchez sits down for breakfast one morning and immediately notices something is wrong with a man everyone else at the table treats like a member of the family. That man is introduced as Uncle Steve, and according to Jerry, Beth, Morty, and Summer, he has been living in their house for an entire year. Rick has no memory of him at all, and instead of going along with the room to avoid an awkward moment, he says so out loud. Within minutes, that single moment of suspicion turns into a fight for survival. And by the end of the day, Rick's instinct to trust his own memory over everyone else's turns out to be the only thing standing between his family and total takeover by an alien threat nobody else in the house could even see coming. The episode is called Total Recall, and it aired in August of 2015 as the 4th episode of Season 2. It was written by Mike McMahon and directed by Juan Meza Leon. The setup begins with the Smith family gathered for a normal family breakfast, except for the fact that Uncle Steve, a man nobody has ever mentioned before, is sitting right there with them. Jerry gets an email confirming plane tickets, and Uncle Steve explains that he bought them as a thank you gift for letting him stay with the family for the past year. Everyone reacts like this is completely normal, laughing and thanking him, until Rick walks into the room and asks who exactly this person is. The family is confused by Rick's confusion, insisting that Uncle Steve has always been around. Rick does not back down, and that refusal to simply accept what everyone else in the room is treating as obvious turns out to be the first sign that something is seriously wrong with the house. What makes this moment worth paying attention to is how easy it would have been for Rick to just go along with it. Every other person in that kitchen accepts Uncle Steve without question. Jerry treats him like an old friend. Beth and the kids treat him like part of the family. If Rick had shrugged, laughed it off, and decided he must have just forgotten someone, the entire day would have ended very differently and probably much worse. Instead, Rick trusts the gap in his own memory more than he trusts the comfort and warmth the rest of the family clearly feels around this stranger. He does not know yet what Uncle Steve actually is, but he knows something does not add up, and he refuses to pretend otherwise just to keep the peace at the table. Rick's suspicion turns out to be completely correct. Uncle Steve is not a person at all. He is one of many alien parasites that have quietly invaded the house, and these parasites do not work by force or by hiding in the shadows. They work by attaching themselves to memory itself. Each parasite creates a fake memory of a relationship that never existed, plants that memory directly into the minds of everyone nearby, and then simply appears in the flesh once the memory feels real enough to support it. Once one parasite successfully creates itself this way, the process repeats, and more of these strange, invented characters start showing up around the house, each one treated by the family as someone who has always been a part of their lives. Rick understands almost immediately what is happening once the first few of these strange characters start piling up. A dinosaur carrying a camera, a giant rubber duck with human arms, a small creature shaped like a pencil, a talking cat named Tinkles, a spirit trapped inside a jar, and the man who claims to be its friend. All of them show up over a short stretch of time, and each one is treated with the same instant, easy familiarity that Uncle Steve got at breakfast. Rick recognizes the pattern before anyone else does, and he tries to warn the rest of the family that this flood of unfamiliar, oddly specific new faces is not something to feel comforted by. He tells them directly to be careful of any strange, over-the-top character that seems to just appear out of nowhere. His warning is blunt, and it turns out to be exactly the right read on the situation, even though the rest of the family is far too charmed by these new memories to listen closely at first. This is where the episode becomes less about a strange alien invasion and more about how easily a group of people can be manipulated once you offer them memories that feel good. The parasites do not attack anyone physically in the early stages. They do not need to. All they have to do is exist as a pleasant memory, and the family welcomes them in without asking a single hard question. Rick is the one person immune to this charm offensive, not because he is somehow smarter about emotions than everyone else, but because his first instinct when something does not match his own memory is distrust rather than acceptance. That instinct, which could easily be mistaken for coldness or paranoia in a normal situation, becomes the exact skill needed to survive this one. As more of these fake relatives and friends fill up the house, Rick moves to seal the place off, activating a defensive shield built into the home to stop anything else from getting in or out. This turns the situation from a strange breakfast into a full lockdown, with the family trapped inside a house that is rapidly filling with creatures nobody can be completely sure are real. The tension builds quickly from here, because the parasites are not passive. Once they realize Rick is onto them and is actively working to stop them, they shift strategy, and instead of just adding more fake memories, they start trying to turn the family against the one person capable of stopping them. The parasites convince Morty, Beth, and Summer that Rick himself is the parasite, planting the idea that his memories of being their grandfather and father figure are the fake ones, and that the real threat has been sitting at the dinner table with them the entire time. At the same time, they convince Jerry that he is a parasite too, along with a fabricated secret relationship with another parasite named Sleepy Gary. The full family, now thoroughly confused about who among them is even real, turns on Rick, with Morty selected to be the one who actually pulls the trigger. For a brief stretch of the episode, the show puts the audience in the uncomfortable position of watching the one character who has been right about the danger from the very beginning get treated as the danger itself, purely because the people around him have been fed a version of reality that feels warmer and easier to accept. The turning point comes from Morty, and it depends entirely on the very thing the parasites cannot fake. Morty realizes, standing there with a weapon aimed at the grandfather he has been told to distrust, that these creatures can only ever create pleasant, happy memories. They have no ability to plant a bad one. Morty has plenty of unpleasant memories involving Rick, memories of being dragged into dangerous situations, memories of being yelled at, memories of being put in real danger without much concern for his safety. Those memories are unglamorous and often painful, but they are exactly the kind of memory a parasite would never bother to create, because a parasite's entire method of survival depends on being liked. Using that one detail, Morty is able to tell the difference between characters who are genuinely part of the family and characters who only feel like they are. Once Morty figures out the test, the family works through the house together, checking each person against the same standard. Do they have any memory of this person that is not pleasant? If the answer is no, that person becomes suspect. If the answer is yes, no matter how minor or embarrassing that memory might be, that person is treated as real. Rick and Morty go from room to room using this method, and one by one, the parasites are exposed and eliminated. Negative memories involving Summer and Beth end up confirming their identities the same way. Even Jerry, who briefly believes he might be a parasite himself once he learns the truth about Sleepy Gary, is eventually reassured once it becomes clear that Beth genuinely has painful, complicated memories of her marriage to him, proving that whatever their relationship actually is, it is real. By the end of the fighting, only the immediate family and one additional character remains standing in the house. That character is Mr. Poopy Butthole, a small, soft-spoken creature who has been treated throughout the episode and even in the show's opening title sequence, as though he has simply always been part of the family, with no explanation ever given for how or when he joined. At dinner, once the parasite threat seems fully cleared, Beth realizes something troubling. She cannot recall a single unpleasant memory involving Mr. Poopy Butthole. Applying the same test that saved the rest of the family throughout the day, she shoots him without warning. This final beat of the episode is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable rather than simply clever, because the method that worked perfectly all day suddenly produces a devastating and uncertain result. Mr. Poopy Butthole survives the shooting, but the moment leaves the family and the audience without a clean answer. It has since been confirmed outside the episode itself that Mr. Poopy Butthole is in fact a slightly different kind of parasite from the ones the family fought off that day, one capable of existing without needing to cause anyone harm the way the others did. Inside the episode, though, that distinction is never fully proven on screen, and Beth is left having shot someone the family loved for years based on a test that, for the first time all day, might not have applied cleanly. Even with that uncertainty hanging over the ending, the core point of the episode still holds up in Rick's favor. He was the first person in the house to notice that something did not match reality. He was the first to warn everyone about the flood of unfamiliar, unusually charming new characters showing up out of nowhere. He was the one who understood, faster than anyone else, that the parasites were using pleasant memories as their method of attack, which meant the only reliable defense had to come from memories that were not pleasant at all. Every single piece of the solution that eventually saved the family traces back to the instinct Rick displayed the moment Uncle Steve sat down at that breakfast table and Rick refused to smile and nod along with everyone else. There is something worth sitting with in how differently this episode treats Rick compared to a lot of his usual appearances on the show. In many other stories, his distrust and cynicism come across as exhausting, even cruel, especially when they are aimed directly at people who love him. In this episode, that same instinct becomes the thing that saves everyone's life. His unwillingness to accept a warm, comfortable version of events just because it feels nice is usually framed as a flaw in his personality. Here, it is framed as the only working alarm system in a house full of people who would have happily let themselves be replaced, one comforting memory at a time, if left unchecked. It also says something about how the parasites specifically chose to attack. They did not try to overpower the family with strength or trickery involving fear. They used kindness, familiarity, and comfort as their weapon, understanding correctly that most people will not question a good feeling nearly as hard as they question a bad one. Rick is the one character built to question good feelings by default, and while that quality makes him difficult to live with on an ordinary day, it makes him exactly the right person to have around on the one day an entire species of memory-eating parasites decides to move in. By the time dinner finally settles and the shooting involving Mr. Poopy Butthole fades into an uneasy silence, the family has technically survived the day, but not without damage. Trust has been tested in a very literal way, with each member forced to prove their own reality to the others using nothing but pain and discomfort as evidence. Rick's read on the danger was accurate from the very first sign of it. The method that saved everyone came directly from a lesson in how differently real relationships and manufactured ones behave once memory is on the line. Whether that lesson was worth what it cost Mr. Poopy Butthole is a question the episode never fully answers. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same kind of gap between what someone is warned about and what they choose to do anyway shows up again almost immediately in the show's timeline. Except this time, it is Morty ignoring a warning instead of proving one right, and the creature at the center of it turns out to be a lot less harmless than the person trying to save it wants to believe. Section 03, the fart warning. Rick Sanchez tells Morty flatly not to release a strange gaseous creature from a containment cell, and Morty ignores him completely. That single decision to override Rick's warning ends up dragging the two of them through a chase across an alien planet, a betrayal from one of Rick's own business contacts, and a firefight with armed law enforcement, all before the truth about the creature finally comes out. By the end of the episode, it turns out Rick's instinct to leave the situation alone was the only reasonable read on it from the very beginning, and Morty is the one left holding the weapon that proves it. The episode is called Mortonite Run, and it aired in August of 2015 as the second episode of Season 2. It was written by David Phillips and directed by Dominic Polcino. The story begins with an ordinary errand. Rick is dropping off Jerry at a daycare center built specifically for different versions of Jerry from across the multiverse. A place designed to keep him occupied and out of the way while Rick and Morty go do something else. While teaching Morty how to drive his ship, Rick gets a call from a business contact and has Morty pull into a parking garage to meet him. That contact turns out to be an alien named Krombopulos Michael, a professional killer who pays Rick a large amount of alien currency in exchange for a powerful weapon capable of destroying matter itself. Morty is bothered almost immediately by how casually his grandfather treats this transaction. Krombopulos Michael is cheerful and polite, talking about his job the same way someone might talk about running errands, mentioning that he has no moral limits on who he will kill for money, whether that target is a child, an elderly person, or anything in between. Rick brushes off Morty's discomfort and explains that the money from the sale is meant to pay for an afternoon at a large arcade called Blips and Chits, treating the entire exchange as a simple, practical way to fund a fun day out. Morty cannot let it go, and while Rick is distracted inside the arcade playing a virtual reality game, Morty takes the ship on his own to try to stop the assassin before he can complete the job. Morty's attempt to intervene does not go the way he plans. Trying to pilot the ship himself, he accidentally crashes directly into Krombopulos Michael, killing him instantly and completely by accident. Rick arrives shortly after through a portal, cutting down a guard who is about to shoot Morty, and the two of them discover what the assassin had actually been hired to kill. Inside a containment cell is a strange, glowing cloud of gas, calm and articulate, capable of communicating through direct thought rather than speech. When Morty asks for its name, the creature explains that its kind has no real use for names, and struggles at first to find a word Morty will understand for the ability it is using to talk to him. Rick, annoyed by the entire situation, jokingly gives the creature the name Fart, and the name sticks for the rest of the episode. This is the exact moment where Rick draws a clear line, and it is worth paying close attention to what he actually says, because it becomes the entire point of the episode. Fart, still trapped in the cell, politely asks Morty to release him, claiming to be in serious pain and clearly counting on Morty's sense of guilt and sympathy to get free. Rick tells Morty directly not to do it. He does not explain a long, detailed reason at that exact second, but his objection is immediate and specific, coming from someone who has already spent his entire life dealing with unknown alien life forms and understands exactly how dangerous it can be to trust one on nothing but its own word. Morty looks at Rick, hesitates for a moment, and then pulls the lever anyway, letting Fart out of the cell. From that single choice, everything in the episode spirals in a direction Rick clearly did not want any part of. Alarms immediately start going off through the building. Fart, now free, is gaseous and cannot pass safely through one of Rick's portals, which means the simplest and safest way out of the situation is no longer available. Rick makes this limitation clear right away, pointing out that Fart's physical form will not survive being pulled through a portal the way a solid body could. Morty, unwilling to just leave the creature behind after freeing it, insists that they now have no choice but to bring Fart along in the ship itself, forcing Rick into a situation he never wanted to be part of in the first place. Rick complains openly about wanting to go back to the arcade and finish his afternoon in peace, making it clear that this entire chain of events, starting with the assassin's death and ending with a gas creature sitting in the back of his ship, is the direct result of Morty ignoring one simple instruction. The trouble only builds from there. Rick, Morty, and Fart end up fleeing to the planet of an old associate of Rick's, a mechanical being known as Gearhead, in order to get their damaged ship repaired. While Rick is dealing with repairs, Fart begins singing a strange, dreamlike song about unity and existing without pain, one that starts playing out as a kind of hallucination inside Morty's mind, hinting at values and a worldview that sound peaceful on the surface but carry an unsettling weight underneath them. Meanwhile, Gearhead, despite years of working with Rick, decides the reward being offered for turning them in is too valuable to pass up, and calls the authorities on his own supposed friend. Rick reacts to this betrayal exactly the way you would expect from someone whose trust has just been used against him, and the group is forced to fight and flee their way off the planet as law enforcement closes in from every direction. During the escape, Fart uses its own abilities to help distract and disrupt the pursuing forces, appearing at this point in the episode to genuinely be assisting Rick and Morty in getting away safely. It would be easy, watching this section alone, to assume that Fart really is exactly what it appears to be, a gentle, misunderstood creature simply trying to get home after an accidental trip through a wormhole. That is precisely the impression the episode wants the audience to sit with for a while, right up until the moment it becomes clear why Rick never wanted any part of this rescue mission to begin with. Once they finally reach the wormhole that leads back to Fart's home region, Rick prepares to send the creature through and be done with the entire ordeal. It is at this point, standing right at the edge of the portal home, that Fart finally reveals its true intentions to Morty. Its species does not view carbon-based life forms, the kind of life that makes up humans and most creatures Morty has ever known, as harmless or worth protecting. Instead, they view carbon-based life as something closer to a disease, a threat to what they consider higher forms of existence, and Fart openly tells Morty that its kind plans to come back through the wormhole in much greater numbers with the specific goal of wiping out all carbon-based life it can find. This is the moment the entire episode has been quietly building toward, and it lands with real weight, because it forces Morty to confront exactly what his own choice back in that containment cell actually set in motion. He did not simply free an innocent creature from unfair captivity. He freed something that, left unchecked, intends to bring about the deaths of an enormous number of living things, possibly including everyone Morty has ever known. Faced with this truth, Morty makes the difficult decision to ask Fart to sing once more, and while the creature is caught up in that final peaceful, unaware moment, Morty shoots and kills it, using the same antimatter weapon that started the entire chain of events back in the parking garage. There is a sharp, uncomfortable irony sitting at the center of this ending. Morty spent the entire episode trying to prove that saving a life mattered more than staying uninvolved, insisting that selling a weapon to an assassin made Rick just as responsible for a death as pulling the trigger himself. By the final minutes of the story, Morty is the one holding that same weapon, using it to end a life directly, in order to prevent an even greater number of deaths from happening later. Rick does not let this irony slide by quietly either, pointing out to Morty afterward that a considerable number of people ended up dead throughout the day as a direct result of Morty's decision to get involved in the first place, tying the guards, the betrayal by Gearhead, and the chaos of the entire escape back to that one moment of stepping in the containment room. None of this erases the fact that Rick was the one person in the entire episode who reacted correctly the instant the situation presented itself. He did not know the specific details of what Fart's species intended to do. He simply understood, based on nothing but experience and instinct, that releasing an unknown creature from captivity without understanding what it actually was carried real risk, and that risk was not worth taking on a whim just because the creature sounded polite and asked nicely. Morty's decision was driven by sympathy, by a desire to do the right thing in the moment, and by a fair amount of guilt over Rick's blunt attitude towards selling the weapon in the first place. Rick's decision was driven by caution, and caution turned out to be the correct read on a creature whose true nature was hidden behind a calm voice and a gentle song. It is also worth noting how the episode frames Rick's later comment to Morty about the bodies that piled up throughout the day. Rick is not gloating about being proven right in some triumphant way. He is simply stating a fact, almost in passing, forcing Morty to sit with the actual cost of overriding someone with more experience purely because that person's warning felt cold or uncaring at the time. Rick's coldness in that containment room was never really about lacking sympathy. It was about recognizing a threat that Morty, blinded by good intentions, could not yet see. By the end of the episode, Fart is dead. The wormhole leading to its homeworld remains a threat that never gets fully resolved on screen, and Morty is left carrying the emotional weight of having killed something he tried so hard to save only a short time earlier. Rick, for his part, simply moves on, picking up a version of Jerry from the daycare center without much concern over which exact version they end up bringing home, treating the entire ordeal as another chaotic day that has already passed. The warning he gave right at the start, the one Morty chose to ignore, turned out to be the single most accurate read of the entire situation, delivered in only a few words, well before anyone else in the room had any real reason to believe him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same pattern, something calm and reasonable sounding on the outside, turning out to hide a much larger and more dangerous truth underneath, shows up again almost immediately in the show's timeline. Except this time, the danger is not a stranger locked in a cell. It comes from something Rick lets in far closer to himself, something built entirely around comfort, closeness, and the promise of never feeling alone again. Section 04, The Hive Mind Problem. Rick Sanchez runs into an old girlfriend who happens to control the mind of an entire planet, and for a while, it looks like the perfect relationship for a man who has spent his whole life avoiding real connection. She never argues with him. She never gets tired of his moods. She can reshape reality around him just to keep him entertained. By the end of the episode, that same relationship falls apart in exactly the way Rick's own outlook on life would predict, and the being who breaks up with him spells out, in her own words, that the two of them were never going to work, not because they were too different, but because they were too much alike. The episode is called Autoerotic Assimilation, and it aired in August of 2015 as the third episode of Season 2. It was written by Ryan Ridley and directed by Brian Newton. The story opens with Rick, Morty, and Summer landing on a planet that turns out to belong to a hive mind named Unity, a single consciousness that has taken control of every living body across the entire population. Unity and Rick used to date, and the moment they see each other again, it becomes clear that whatever they had together was intense, chaotic, and never anywhere close to normal. Unity is voiced by Christina Hendricks, though because the character speaks through countless different bodies at once, several other voices are used throughout the episode as well, each one representing a different person whose mind now belongs to the collective. Summer's reaction to all of this is the most human one in the room. She is deeply uncomfortable with the idea that an entire population has lost its individual will, taken over completely by one shared mind. She sees it as a form of slavery, dressed up as harmony, a society that only looks peaceful because every single person inside it has been forced to want the same things. Rick, on the other hand, does not seem bothered by any of this at all. He slips right back into his old relationship with Unity, and the two of them dive straight into a long, extravagant stretch of partying, drinking, and indulgence, with Unity reshaping entire aspects of the planet just to keep Rick amused. She builds him an entire television show simply so he can enjoy the experience of canceling it and then bringing it back on a whim. She creates a large stone monument in honor of Morty and Summer, similar in style to a famous carved mountain, purely as a passing gesture during the excitement of having Rick around again. While Rick loses himself completely in this relationship, Summer takes it upon herself to try to do something about what she sees as an injustice. She works to help free members of the population from Unity's control, believing that giving people their individual minds and free will back is obviously the right thing to do, no mad expectation questioned. This is where the episode delivers its sharpest and most uncomfortable turn. The people freed from Unity's control do not turn into peaceful, grateful individuals reclaiming their lives. Almost immediately, without Unity's guiding presence holding them together, some of them turn to violence, some slip into behavior that ranges from disturbing to outright criminal, and entire groups split off into open conflict with each other, escalating into what can only be described as a war breaking out across parts of the planet. Summer, who set out to correct what she believed was clearly wrong, ends up watching her own good intentions produce a level of chaos and suffering that Unity's control had actually been holding back the entire time. This detail matters enormously for understanding what the episode is actually arguing underneath all of its humor. Summer's instinct, that no one should have their free will taken away against their wishes, is not treated by the show as foolish or naive. It is a reasonable, decent belief for anyone to hold. The problem is that the show does not let that belief stand on its own without consequence. The moment individual freedom is restored to people who had spent who knows how long living entirely inside someone else's collective mind, the result is not relief or gratitude. It is disorder, harm, and violence breaking out at a scale Summer never anticipated. The show forces her, and the audience along with her, to sit with the uncomfortable possibility that the version of order Unity provided, however troubling on a moral level, may have actually been keeping a great deal of harm contained. Rick, notably, never gets directly involved in Summer's crusade to free the population, and his lack of involvement ends up saying almost as much as any speech he could have given about it. He is not shown warning her against interfering the way he warned Morty in earlier situations. He simply does not participate, staying wrapped up in his own relationship with Unity while Summer runs her own experiment in a completely different part of the planet. That distance turns out to be its own kind of accurate read on the situation. Rick has spent years traveling to countless different worlds, watching countless different societies rise and fall, and his instinct to stay out of a moral crusade he has no real stake in ends up sparing him from being anywhere near the disaster Summer's good intentions create. He does not need to warn anyone that meddling in a system this complicated could go wrong, because his entire pattern of behavior throughout the show already assumes that outcome as a given. Staying detached from Summer's plan is not laziness on his part. It is consistent with a worldview that has already seen this exact kind of well-meaning interference blow up in someone's face more times than he can probably count. The relationship between Rick and Unity, meanwhile, keeps sliding further into something genuinely unhealthy. Unity, at least at first, claims that she has grown and changed since her wilder days, suggesting she has learned to control her own worst impulses. Almost as soon as Rick re-enters her life, that growth collapses completely, and she throws herself right back into the same reckless, indulgent patterns the two of them apparently shared in the past. She begins losing control over parts of her own collective, particularly over the bodies she is using to keep track of Morty and Summer, putting the two of them in real danger during the chaos caused by her multi-day bender with Rick. This is the clearest sign in the entire episode that Rick's presence, whatever affection might genuinely exist underneath it, tends to pull the people closest to him toward instability rather than stability, a pattern that shows up again and again throughout the larger series whenever anyone gets too close to him for too long. Eventually, Summer and Morty step in and directly tell both Rick and Unity that the relationship between them is doing real damage, warning Unity in particular that staying involved with Rick is not good for her. Unity, notably, is the one who ultimately makes the decision to end things, not Rick. When Rick briefly leaves the party to use the restroom, he returns to find that every single inhabitant of the planet is simply gone, each person having quietly slipped away, leaving behind identical farewell letters explaining the decision. The letters describe how Unity has come to realize that continuing the relationship is not sustainable, not because Rick and Unity are too different from one another, but because they are, in a strange and uncomfortable way, nearly the same. Both of them, according to the explanation left behind, shape the people around them into versions of themselves. Unity does this literally, absorbing individual minds directly into her own collective consciousness. Rick does the same thing through influence alone, pulling the people close to him into his own patterns of recklessness and self-destruction without ever needing to touch their minds directly. This single detail is the entire argument of the episode compressed into one sentence. And it matters here specifically because it confirms something about Rick that the show has already been suggesting all along, even before this episode existed. Rick has never pretended to be a healthy influence on the people he loves. He has never claimed that closeness with him leads anywhere good. His entire personality, across every episode that came before this one, is built around distance, control, and a refusal to depend on anyone or let anyone depend on him in a stable, lasting way. Unity, a being capable of reshaping entire societies and reading through the minds of an entire population, looks at Rick after spending real time with him again and reaches the exact same conclusion Rick's own behavior has been quietly broadcasting for as long as the show has existed. She does not discover some hidden flaw buried deep inside him that nobody else could see. She simply confirms, using her own unique perspective, something Rick has never bothered to hide from anyone in the first place. Left alone after Unity and her entire assimilated population vanish without warning, Rick does not respond with any dramatic breakdown or obvious display of grief in front of Morty and Summer. He mostly moves on the way he tends to move on from almost everything, treating the sudden and painful end of the relationship as another thing that happened rather than something worth dwelling on out loud. The quiet, understated way the show handles his reaction, without a big speech or an emotional confession, fits the same pattern Unity described in her farewell letter. Rick does not sit and process what just happened to him. He absorbs it and keeps moving, exactly the kind of behavior that makes him so difficult for anyone to stay close to in the long run. There is a wider point sitting underneath both storylines running through this episode, one involving Summer's failed attempt to bring individual freedom back to an assimilated population, and one involving Rick's relationship with the very being responsible for that assimilation in the first place. Both storylines end up confirming something uncomfortable about control, freedom, and connection that the show rarely states directly but keeps proving through its own events. Summer learns that removing control from people's lives does not automatically lead to something better, and in this case, leads directly to violence and disorder instead. Rick, without ever needing to learn anything new about himself, gets an outside confirmation of exactly what kind of partner he has always been, delivered by someone with the unique ability to see straight through to the truth of an entire relationship at once. None of this makes Rick a hero in this episode, and the show never tries to frame him that way. He does not warn anyone about anything in advance the way he did with Morty back in the containment cell during an earlier adventure. He does not step in to stop Summer's plan before it spirals into open conflict. What he does instead is simply continue being exactly who he already is, without pretending to be capable of something healthier or more stable than what his actual behavior has always shown. Unity's farewell letter is not really new information for the audience. It is a confirmation, coming from the one being on the planet uniquely positioned to know for certain that Rick's pattern of pulling people into chaos was never an exaggeration or a misunderstanding. It was simply accurate, whether he ever said it out loud or not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same pattern, someone getting pulled toward a dangerous situation because it looks appealing on the surface, comes back again almost immediately afterward, except this time it involves Summer walking straight into a deal she does not fully understand, with a warning from Rick sitting right there in front of her the entire time, waiting to see whether she will actually listen to it. Section 05. The Devil's Store. Rick Sanchez looks at a strange old man running a small thrift shop and asks him, almost immediately and completely seriously, whether he happens to be the actual devil. The man denies it at first, but the accusation rattles him enough that Rick's suspicion never really goes away for the rest of the episode. Summer, who has just taken a job working for this same man, brushes off her grandfather's warning as one more example of him being difficult and paranoid for no reason. By the end of the episode, it turns out the shop owner really is exactly what Rick guessed he was from the very first conversation, and Summer ends up learning that lesson the hard way, through a betrayal that costs her far more than a simple argument with her grandfather ever could have. The episode is called Something Ricked This Way Comes, and it aired in March of 2014 as the 9th episode of Season 1. It was written by Mike McMahon and directed by John Rice. The story begins with an ordinary morning at the Smith household. Morty needs help with a science project, and since Jerry is trying to prove he can be useful, he jumps in to help Morty instead of driving Summer to her new job. That leaves Rick stuck giving Summer a ride to the small shop where she has just started working, a place called Needful Things, run by a man who calls himself Mr. Needful. The moment Rick steps inside the shop with Summer, something about the place puts him on edge. The shelves are filled with strange, old-fashioned items that seem to promise something a little too perfect for whoever buys them. Rick, never one to hold back an accusation just because it might be socially awkward, looks directly at Mr. Needful and asks him outright whether he is the devil. Mr. Needful reacts with obvious discomfort at the question, brushing it aside and trying to move the conversation along, but the reaction itself is telling. A completely ordinary shopkeeper would likely laugh off a question like that without a second thought. Mr. Needful instead seems startled, almost caught off guard, the exact kind of reaction someone gives when an accusation lands closer to the truth than they were prepared for. Summer, embarrassed by her grandfather's bluntness, tries to smooth things over and defends her new boss. She points out that Mr. Needful has been kind to her, that he treats her with respect, and that compared to other businesses willing to hire a teenager, working for a slightly strange old man who sells odd trinkets does not seem like the worst option available. She even argues that plenty of ordinary businesses cause harm in their own ways, comparing the shop to fast food companies that contribute to poor health or clothing companies that rely on unfair labor. Her reasoning is not unreasonable on the surface. Almost every job has some kind of downside if you look closely enough, and judging a business purely by its worst qualities could make almost any workplace look sinister if you tried hard enough. The problem is that Mr. Needful's shop is not simply flawed the way an ordinary business might be. It is built entirely around a very specific and dangerous kind of deception, one that becomes clear as the episode continues. Every item inside Needful Things comes with a hidden cost attached to it, a curse that activates once the item is used or worn, and that curse is never explained to the customer up front. People walk in wanting something simple, like Mr. Goldenfold, a character from earlier episodes, who receives a cologne that makes him irresistible to women. What he does not realize until it is too late is that the very same cologne leaves him unable to follow through on any of the attention it earns him, a painful and humiliating price hidden behind what looked, at first glance, like a small, harmless gift. This is the exact pattern Rick's initial suspicion was picking up on before anyone else in the episode understood what was actually happening. He did not need to see the curses activate to know something was wrong with the shop. He simply recognized, almost on instinct, that a business offering items for free with no real explanation for how or why was almost certainly hiding something behind that generosity. Summer's defense of her new boss was based on kindness and fairness, both perfectly reasonable values to hold in an ordinary situation. Rick's suspicion was based on pattern recognition built from years of encountering exactly this kind of deal, the kind where nothing valuable is ever actually free, no matter how pleasant the person offering it might seem. Once the curses inside the shop start becoming impossible to ignore, Rick shifts from simply being suspicious of Mr. Needful to actively working against him. Rather than trying to warn Summer again through argument, which clearly did not work the first time, he takes a much more direct approach, building a device capable of identifying exactly what curse is attached to any object inside the shop. Using this device, he opens up a rival business right next door called Curse Purge Plus, where he strips away the negative half of each curse while leaving the positive benefit completely intact. In practical terms, this means people can walk into Rick's shop, buy an item that used to belong to Mr. Needful's stock, and receive all of the benefit with none of the hidden cost that was supposed to come attached to it. This move devastates Mr. Needful in a way that goes far beyond simple business competition. His entire existence as the devil depends on being able to offer people something that feels like generosity while quietly collecting a price behind their backs. Rick removing that hidden price does not just undercut his profits. It removes the very mechanism that makes him who he is. Mr. Needful becomes so distraught over the situation that he actually attempts to take his own life, overwhelmed by the realization that Rick, a human being with nothing more than scientific tools and a portable understanding of how curses work, has effectively made his entire supernatural business obsolete. At one point, he says as much directly, admitting that people like Rick are the reason he is becoming irrelevant, and even goes so far as to suggest that Rick himself might be a more effective and more thorough version of the very thing Mr. Needful is supposed to represent. Summer, despite everything that has happened up to this point, still has enough sympathy left to step in and stop Mr. Needful from following through on his suicide attempt. She convinces him that his business can survive without depending on hidden curses, suggesting he transform the shop into something more modern, an online business that could reach far more customers without needing supernatural trickery to succeed. For a brief moment, it looks like Summer's kindness and creativity might actually turn things around for the man she still, despite Rick's repeated warnings, wants to believe is capable of being decent. That moment of hope does not last. Once the new online version of the business starts generating serious profit, Mr. Needful turns on Summer completely, cutting her out of the success she helped create and taking the credit and the money for himself. The betrayal is blunt and humiliating, framed in the episode almost like the kind of story you might hear about a young employee getting pushed out of a company they helped build, except with the added detail that the person doing the pushing is, quite literally, the devil. Summer is left with nothing to show for her effort except the sharp realization that trusting this man, despite every warning sign that had been sitting right in front of her from the very first day, turned out to be exactly the mistake her grandfather tried to point out before she ever stepped foot inside the shop. What makes this turn of events land so effectively is how directly it connects back to that very first scene in the shop, the one where Rick simply looked at a stranger and asked whether he was the devil. Summer's whole argument for defending Mr. Needful rested on the idea that he seemed kind, that he treated her with respect, and that respect alone made him worth trusting, compared to other, more obviously harsh employers. Kindness and respect, as it turns out, cost the devil nothing to hand out, especially when the entire foundation of his business already depends on making people believe they are getting something valuable for free. Rick's suspicion was never really about Mr. Needful being unkind. It was about recognizing that unearned generosity almost always comes with strings attached, whether those strings are visible right away or not. Once the betrayal is out in the open, Summer decides she is done being patient. She and Rick team up, using items pulled directly from the cursed inventory to physically transform themselves, building enormous muscle in a short amount of time so they can confront Mr. Needful directly rather than trying to out-argue or outsmart him one more time. What follows is a fast, almost cartoonish stretch of the episode where Rick and Summer, now dramatically stronger than before, go on a short spree of confrontations, taking down not just Mr. Needful himself, but a handful of other clearly unpleasant characters they encounter along the way, including a bully, a member of a hate group, and a person mistreating an animal. The sequence plays out more like a fast, satisfying montage than a serious action scene. But underneath the exaggerated humor, it represents Summer finally acting on the same instinct Rick had from the very beginning. The instinct that recognized exactly what kind of person she was dealing with long before she was willing to admit it herself. By the final stretch of the episode, Rick goes one step further than simply defeating Mr. Needful in a fight. He uses his curse-detecting device to strip away every remaining curse still active on every item still sitting inside the shop, meaning that anyone who had already bought something cursed no longer has to pay the hidden price they agreed to, whether they realized they had agreed to it or not. On paper, this looks like a purely good outcome, freeing an entire town from a string of hidden supernatural debts they never should have owed in the first place. Mr. Needful, however, points out something uncomfortable buried inside that same act of generosity. By removing every consequence attached to every deal, Rick has essentially done exactly what the devil does, offering people something for nothing, except on a much larger and more thorough scale than Mr. Needful himself ever managed. Mr. Needful even states plainly that Rick, in this moment, is functioning as something worse than he is, a claim the episode does not really try to argue against. This closing detail adds a layer of complexity to the entire situation without undoing the core point of the episode. Rick's original suspicion about Mr. Needful being the devil was correct from the very first scene. His instinct that something about the shop's generosity did not add up was also correct, confirmed completely by the curses hidden inside every item and by the betrayal Summer eventually suffered at Mr. Needful's hands. At the same time, the episode does not let Rick walk away looking clean or heroic simply because his suspicion turned out to be accurate. Being right about a threat does not automatically mean the way you deal with that threat comes without its own consequences. And Rick undoing every curse in the shop without any real thought about the wider effects of that decision fits neatly into a pattern that shows up again and again across the show, where his solutions solve the immediate problem in front of him while creating a new and different kind of mess just underneath the surface. Summer, for her part, ends the episode having learned a harder lesson than she probably expected when she first took the job. She did not need her grandfather to be right about everything for his original warning to matter. She only needed him to be right about the one specific thing that ended up costing her the most, and by the time the credits roll, it is clear that the man who greeted her on her very first day at work with nothing more than a simple, blunt question about whether he happened to be the devil, saw the situation for exactly what it was long before she was ready to accept it herself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same willingness to call out a threat before anyone else in the room is ready to believe it comes up again soon after. Except the next time it happens, the threat is not a stranger running a small shop in town. It comes from a group of costumed heroes that an entire generation of fans, including someone very close to Rick, has already decided to trust completely. Section 06. The Vindicator's Problem. Rick Sanchez is dragged into a mission with a superhero team he clearly does not respect. And within the first few minutes of meeting them, he starts mocking every member of the group except for their janitor. Morty is embarrassed by his grandfather's attitude, insisting that these heroes are brave, selfless, and worth admiring. By the end of the episode, once the full truth about this team comes out, it becomes painfully clear that Rick's contempt for them was not simply bitterness or jealousy. It was an accurate read on exactly who these people actually were underneath their costumes and their catchphrases. The episode is called Vindicators 3: The Return of Worldender, and it aired in August of 2017 as the 4th episode of Season 3. It was written by Sarah Carbiener and Erica Rosby and directed by Brian Newton. The story begins with Morty forcing Rick to join a mission with a superhero team called the Vindicators, using a promise Rick made to him earlier in the show that gave Morty the right to choose every 10th adventure the two of them go on. Morty clearly idolizes this team, treating the invitation as a genuine honor, while Rick makes it obvious from the very first meeting that he thinks the whole idea of costumed heroes fighting a galaxy-ending villain is ridiculous. Once Rick and Morty arrive on the team's base, they are introduced to each member one at a time. There is Supernova, a being made of cosmic energy. There is Crocubot, part crocodile and part machine. There is Alan Rails, a grieving figure who gained the ability to summon ghost trains after his parents died in a railroad accident. There is Million Ants, a colony of ants acting as a single hero. And there is Vance Maximus, a flashy, self-assured fighter who arrives late because he was busy enjoying a drink during what he calls happy hour. Rick makes fun of nearly every one of them almost immediately, pointing out how derivative and thin their powers and backstories sound. The only member of the team he treats with any real warmth is Noob Noob, a small, quiet janitor who laughs at Rick's jokes instead of getting offended by them. The team explains that a villain named Worldender is threatening the galaxy, and Morty, still caught up in the excitement of being included, is thrilled to be part of the mission. That excitement gets a rough interruption almost right away, when Morty realizes something confusing about the numbering of the team's adventures. He assumed this would be the second time the Vindicators had assembled. Instead, he learns that this is actually the 3rd time. Rick and Morty were left out of the second mission entirely, and the reason given is a personality conflict between Rick and the rest of the group. That excuse turns out to be hiding something much darker. During that second mission, without Rick's help, 3 members of the team were killed, and the group ended up destroying an entire planet, wiping out its population in order to defeat a single shape-shifting enemy hiding somewhere among the people living there. This detail matters enormously, and it is easy to miss just how significant it is on a first watch, because the episode moves past it fairly quickly in the moment. Rick, upon hearing this, points out that if he had simply been included on that mission, he could have built a device capable of identifying the shapeshifter almost instantly, avoiding the need to destroy an entire world just to catch one target. Whether or not that specific claim is something Rick could have actually pulled off, the larger point still lands. A team calling itself a group of heroes chose to erase an entire population rather than solve a difficult problem carefully, and they did it without Rick even being there to suggest a more precise solution. Rick's mockery of this team as reckless and unoriginal, delivered before any of this backstory was revealed, turns out to have been aimed in exactly the right direction. After this uncomfortable reveal, Rick reacts to the situation the way he tends to react to almost everything that frustrates him, by drinking heavily. He becomes completely blackout drunk, and the next morning, the rest of the Vindicators find him unconscious in the briefing room, covered in the evidence of a truly rough night. Rather than dealing with him directly, the team decides to leave him behind with Noob Noob to clean up the mess while the rest of them head out to confront Worldender without him. What none of them realize is that Rick, at some point during his blackout, already went and killed Worldender by himself, along with every one of his henchmen, leaving behind a lair full of bodies for the team to discover once they finally arrive. Instead of simply defeating the villain and being done with it, drunk Rick, apparently working through frustration and resentment toward the entire team, sets up a series of deadly puzzles and traps throughout Worldender's lair, clearly designed as a way of testing and punishing the Vindicators for treating him and Morty as an afterthought. Sober Rick has no memory of any of this by the time the story catches back up to him, which means the version of Rick who built these traps was acting purely on whatever bitterness and jealousy had been building up the night before, unfiltered by any of the restraint he might normally show while sober. The trap sequence that follows plays out like a twisted game show, with a recording of drunk Rick from the night before appearing on a large screen to guide the team through each challenge. The first challenge quickly turns deadly for Vance Maximus, the confident, charming fighter who showed up late to the earlier briefing. Under pressure, Vance's calm exterior falls apart almost immediately, and he reveals that his supportive attitude toward Morty earlier in the episode was never genuine. He openly admits that including Morty on the mission was primarily a publicity move, a way of generating good press for the team, rather than any real gesture of respect or friendship. Trying to escape the trap after this confession, Vance ends up killed in a brutal and graphic way, cut down by one of the very obstacles drunk Rick built specifically to punish exactly this kind of hidden selfishness. The next major challenge forces the team to answer a question about a location tied to their past, and Crocubot steps forward first, confidently naming a planet called Dorian 5. That answer, and the confidence behind it, immediately connects back to the story about the planet destroyed during Vindicators 2. Dorian 5 is revealed to be the very planet the team wiped out in order to kill the shapeshifter hiding among its population. Crocubot gives the wrong answer to whatever specific test drunk Rick had set up around that memory, and is killed for it, seemingly without much thought given by the show to whether Crocubot even understood the full weight of what that planet's destruction actually meant. The lack of guilt shown by some of the surviving Vindicators over losing an entire world in that earlier mission adds another layer of confirmation to Rick's original judgment about this team, suggesting that the deaths involved were treated as an acceptable cost rather than a genuine tragedy. Morty, meanwhile, ends up being the one who solves several of these puzzles correctly, largely because he understands his grandfather's personality and habits better than anyone else in the group. He is able to work out the correct answers by thinking through how Rick behaves when he is deeply intoxicated, drawing on first-hand experience with Rick's blackout ramblings in a way none of the actual superheroes could match. This detail quietly reinforces something the entire episode keeps circling back to. Despite how frustrating and embarrassing Rick can be, Morty's closeness to him, built through years of chaotic, difficult experiences together, ends up being more valuable in this specific crisis than anything the polished, media-friendly Vindicators bring to the table. By the final stretch of the trap sequence, it becomes clear that drunk Rick's entire elaborate gauntlet was never really built with murder as its main goal, even though multiple team members end up dead as a direct result of it. The last part of the challenge leads toward a strange, almost theme park-style experience clearly meant for Noob Noob, the one member of the team Rick actually respected, featuring a recorded message from Rick expressing genuine, if awkwardly delivered, appreciation for him. The tragedy underneath this reveal is that Noob Noob never actually gets to experience any of it, since he stayed behind to clean up Rick's mess instead of joining the mission with everyone else. Making the moment even more bitter, once sober Rick is finally caught up on everything that happened, he does not even remember who Noob Noob is, meaning the one genuinely kind gesture buried inside this entire deadly ordeal ends up being wasted completely, unseen and unrecognized by either the person it was meant for or the person who created it. By the time the dust settles, nearly the entire Vindicators team is dead, with only Supernova and Noob Noob left standing. The episode does not frame this outcome as some kind of clean victory for Rick, and it should not be treated that way either. What drunk Rick did to this team goes far beyond simply proving a point. Real people, however flawed, ended up dead because of a private test built out of jealousy and resentment, and nothing about that outcome deserves to be celebrated or excused. At the same time, separating Rick's behavior from Rick's judgment reveals something worth paying attention to. His initial read on this team, delivered through mockery before any of the darker details came out, turns out to match almost perfectly with what the episode eventually confirms about them. He called them unoriginal, and Morty is later able to correctly identify that exact word as the answer to one of the puzzles, directly tying Rick's blunt insult to the actual truth about the team's derivative nature. He suspected they were not the noble, careful heroes their reputation suggested, and the story about Dorian 5 proves that suspicion correct in the most serious way possible. He clearly did not trust Vance Maximus's easy charm, and Vance's own confession under pressure backs that instinct up directly. None of this makes Rick a hero in this episode, and the show never asks anyone watching to see him that way. His accuracy about the Vindicators does not erase the horror of what he did to them once that accuracy curdled into cruelty. What the episode does manage to hold on to, underneath all of the graphic violence and dark humor, is a distinction that shows up again and again across the series. Rick being right about the flaws in other people does not automatically make whatever he decides to do about those flaws acceptable. Being correct about a threat and behaving responsibly in response to it are two completely separate things. And this episode draws that line about as sharply as the show ever has, using a team of colorful, likable-seeming heroes to prove exactly how much damage a correct judgment can still cause once it gets filtered through someone as reckless and unwilling to let go of a grudge as Rick. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same tension between having a genuinely accurate read on a situation and still causing real harm by acting on it shows up again almost immediately afterward, except the next time it plays out on a much smaller physical scale. Inside a universe Rick himself built by accident, where an entire civilization ends up repeating exactly the kind of mistake Rick always assumed people would make the moment they were given power before they were ready for it. Section 07, the Microverse Warning. Rick Sanchez built an entire universe just to power his car, and he never bothered to think twice about doing it. Morty, horrified once he understands what his grandfather has actually done, calls it slavery with extra steps, a description Rick brushes off without much concern. What makes this episode worth studying closely is not really about whether Rick was right to build the universe in the first place. It is about what happens once someone else inside that universe gets a taste of the same kind of power Rick has always held over them, and how quickly that person follows the exact same path Rick already carved out, almost as if the pattern was never really about Rick specifically at all. The episode is called The Ricks Must Be Crazy, and it aired in August of 2015 as the 6th episode of Season 2. It was written by Dan Guterman and directed by Dominic Polcino. The story begins when Rick's spaceship suddenly stalls out during a trip to another dimension. Rick explains to Morty that the ship runs on something called a microverse battery, and instead of leaving it at that simple explanation, he takes Morty inside the battery itself to fix the problem directly. What Morty discovers once they shrink down and enter is not a simple mechanical part. It is an entire, fully populated universe, complete with its own society, culture, and government, all of it existing purely to generate the electricity that keeps Rick's car running. The method behind this arrangement is almost elegant in how casually exploitative it is. Long ago, Rick gave the people living inside this microverse a piece of technology called a Google box, a device that generates electricity whenever someone uses it, essentially by walking or exercising in place. The inhabitants believe they are simply powering their own homes and cities with this technology. What they do not realize is that Rick quietly redirects a large portion of the electricity generated by their daily lives straight into his car battery, using their labor without their knowledge or consent to keep his own vehicle running. Morty, hearing this explained out loud for the first time, reacts with real discomfort, pointing out that taking labor from an entire population without telling them what it is actually for sounds like nothing more than slavery dressed up with extra steps to make it easier to ignore. Rick does not take this criticism seriously in the moment. He treats Morty's objection as an overreaction, the kind of moral concern someone brings up when they do not fully appreciate how the universe actually works on a practical level. This dismissiveness matters because it sets up exactly the kind of hypocrisy the rest of the episode is built around exposing. Once Rick and Morty land inside the microverse, they meet a leader referred to as President Chris, who informs them that the population no longer needs to rely on the Google box for power at all. A brilliant scientist within the microverse named Zeep Zanflorp has invented a new, more advanced source of energy, one that makes Rick's original system completely obsolete. Rick's reaction to this news says everything about how much power actually meant to him underneath all his casual indifference. He is genuinely upset that his source of stolen electricity might be cut off, and he insists on meeting Zeep directly to understand what this new invention actually is. When they finally reach Zeep, it becomes clear almost immediately that his new energy source is not some entirely different breakthrough. It is essentially the exact same idea Rick used to create the microverse in the first place, except smaller. Zeep has built his own miniature universe, called a miniverse, filled with its own unsuspecting population, and he is quietly draining electricity from their daily lives using a device he calls a flubel crank, the same basic concept as Rick's Google box wearing a different name. This is the moment the episode starts to reveal its real argument. Rick, without a hint of self-awareness at first, begins criticizing Zeep using the exact same points Morty raised earlier about the ethics of exploiting an entire civilization without their knowledge. Morty, watching this unfold, cannot help but point out how strange it is for Rick to suddenly care so much about the exploitation of an unsuspecting population, given that Rick is guilty of the exact same thing on a larger scale. Rick, rather than reflecting seriously on this hypocrisy, has a different kind of realization instead. He understands that if Zeep's miniverse keeps growing and improving, it will eventually make Rick's own microverse completely useless, cutting off Rick's stolen power supply for good. His objection to Zeep's actions was never really about morality in the first place. It was about protecting his own access to free, unnoticed labor. The chain of exploitation does not stop there. Rick suspects that if Zeep followed his own example so closely, there is a good chance someone inside Zeep's own miniverse is doing the exact same thing on an even smaller scale. He turns out to be right. A scientist named Kyle, living inside Zeep's miniverse, has already begun work on his own miniature universe, called a teenyverse, planning to eventually introduce a similar device he intends to call a Blubel Yank once intelligent life develops there, so that he too can quietly siphon away power for his own use. 3 separate layers of civilization, one nested inside the other, each one following the exact same pattern of using an unsuspecting population's labor to sustain a system its own creator understands but keeps hidden from everyone living inside it. This nested repetition is the real proof at the center of the episode. Rick has spent the entire series treating people and civilizations with a deep, almost automatic cynicism, assuming that given enough power and enough technology, most intelligent beings will use both to benefit themselves at someone else's expense, usually while telling themselves a comfortable story about progress or protection to avoid facing what they are actually doing. Zeep, upon gaining exactly the kind of power Rick already had, does not choose a more honest or more caring path. He builds the same kind of hidden exploitation almost immediately, without needing any encouragement from Rick to get there. Kyle, one level further down, is already following the same blueprint before anyone even points it out to him directly. Nobody in this chain needed to be taught to behave this way. Given the tools and the opportunity, each one of them arrived at roughly the same solution, completely on their own. Once Zeep realizes that Rick created his own home universe using the very same methods Zeep is now using on his own unsuspecting population, the relationship between the two of them breaks down entirely. What had briefly looked like 2 brilliant scientists bonding over their shared cleverness turns into a bitter, personal conflict, especially once Zeep understands that his entire civilization's history and achievements exist purely as a side effect of Rick's need for car battery power. The betrayal cuts deep for Zeep specifically because it forces him to see his own accomplishments as nothing more than a byproduct of someone else's convenience. An uncomfortable echo of exactly what his own miniverse population would feel if they ever learned the truth about the flubel crank. The story becomes even more tangled once Rick, Morty, and Zeep travel further down into Kyle's teenyverse to investigate the situation directly. During a struggle there, Kyle chooses to end his own life using his ship, leaving the three of them stranded inside the Teenyverse for what turns out to be several months from their own point of view, even though very little time passes back in the outside world. During this extended stretch, Rick and Zeep attempt to settle their conflict through a series of increasingly absurd, low-tech battles, building crude armored suits out of wood and stone to fight each other, only to end up captured by the native population of the Teenyverse instead. Morty eventually forces the two of them to set their rivalry aside long enough to work together and find a way back out, leading to a short, uneasy truce between Rick and Zeep purely out of necessity. That truce does not last. Once they escape back into the miniverse, Zeep turns on Rick and Morty, attempting to strand or kill them rather than allow them to leave with any advantage over him. Rick, given the choice between trying to negotiate a peaceful outcome or simply eliminating the threat to his own interests, chooses the second option without much hesitation, ultimately destroying Zeep's entire miniverse, and by extension, the Teenyverse nested inside it, wiping out both civilizations completely in order to remove the competing power source and restore his own control over the microverse's electricity. After a final physical fight between the two of them, Rick comes out on top, and with Zeep's alternative power source gone for good, Zeep has no real choice left except to return his own population to the original Google Box system, meaning Rick's car battery starts receiving power again, just as it did before any of this chaos began. There is something genuinely unsettling about how neatly this ending confirms Rick's underlying view of how power actually works among intelligent beings, especially once you consider how the entire chain of events started. Zeep never had to be corrupted or manipulated into becoming exactly like Rick. He simply needed the same opportunity Rick already had, and he built the exact same kind of hidden exploitation almost immediately once that opportunity presented itself. Kyle followed the same pattern one level further down without needing any outside pressure at all. Even Rick's own solution to the conflict, wiping out two entire nested civilizations rather than searching for a way to share power or negotiate an honest arrangement, mirrors the same instinct to protect personal advantage above everything else that started this whole situation in the first place. Morty's original objection that turning an unsuspecting population into an unknowing source of labor is simply slavery wearing a different name never gets disproven anywhere in the episode. If anything, it gets reinforced 3 times over, once through Rick's original microverse, once through Zeep's miniverse, and once through Kyle's unfinished Teenyverse, each one built on the same quiet foundation of hidden exploitation dressed up as scientific progress. Rick's response to all of this is not guilt or reflection. It is simply to make sure his own version of the system keeps running smoothly, treating the entire ordeal as confirmation that this is simply how the universe tends to work once you understand it clearly enough, rather than as any kind of reason to change his own behavior. This is where the episode's proof of Rick's worldview becomes uncomfortable rather than satisfying. Rick is not shown being right in a way that makes him look wise or admirable. He is shown being right in a way that mostly proves how consistently ugly intelligent behavior can become once real power enters the picture, with Zeep and Kyle both serving as living evidence that Rick's cynicism about the natural direction of power was never really about him being uniquely selfish. It was about recognizing a pattern that keeps repeating itself, layer after layer, the moment anyone else is handed the same tools and the same opportunity he already had. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same pattern, something ugly hiding underneath a system that claims to solve a problem cleanly, shows up again soon after in a very different form, when Rick and Morty try to deal with their own personal flaws by simply cutting them out entirely, only to discover that getting rid of the worst parts of yourself does not actually make those parts disappear for good. Section 08, The Toxic Split. Rick Sanchez and Morty walk into an alien spa looking for nothing more than a relaxing break after a brutal 6-day adventure nearly kills both of them. What they walk out with instead is proof of something Rick clearly already understood about himself long before he ever agreed to try the spa's final treatment. Cutting away the worst parts of a person does not actually make that person simpler or safer. It just creates a second version of them, carrying every flaw intact, and in this case, carrying something else too. Something Rick apparently considers one of his own greatest weaknesses. The episode is called Rest and Ricklaxation, and it aired in August of 2017 as the 6th episode of Season 3. It was directed by Anthony Chun and Wesley Archer and written by Tom Kaufman. The story opens with Rick picking Morty up from school for what he promises will be a short errand, which instead turns into a grueling, days-long ordeal involving a dangerous crystal. By the time the adventure finally ends, and the two of them return home with some kind of award for surviving it, both Rick and Morty are clearly suffering from the stress of everything they just went through, to the point where the show treats their exhaustion as an actual mental breakdown rather than a joke to shrug off. Rick decides they have earned a proper vacation, and the two of them head to an alien spa built specifically to help visitors relax and recover. The spa experience escalates in typical Rick and Morty fashion, moving from ordinary treatments into something far more extreme by the end of their visit. The final machine they try together is advertised as a way to completely remove all of a person's toxicity, and both of them agree to give it a try without fully understanding what that removal actually means in practice. Almost immediately after using the machine, Rick and Morty find themselves in a horrifying, gooey wasteland filled with monstrous, disgusting creatures, and at first they assume something has simply gone wrong with the equipment. The truth turns out to be much stranger. The real Rick and Morty have already left the spa completely refreshed and headed home. The versions trapped in this wasteland are not the real Rick and Morty at all. They are the toxic parts of each of them, physically separated out and discarded, left behind in a hidden dimension made up of nothing but the darkest pieces purged from every visitor who has ever used that same machine. Back in the ordinary world, the real Rick and Morty return home looking noticeably different. Rick's usual gray, worn-out complexion has cleared up into something closer to healthy skin, and Morty, freed from the constant self-doubt and anxiety that normally define him, suddenly becomes confident, outgoing, and popular almost overnight. He manages to land a date with Jessica, the girl he has been quietly interested in for a long time, though the date quickly falls apart once his newfound confidence tips over into something closer to overconfidence bordering on cruelty. Without the usual nervousness holding him back, Morty starts behaving with a bluntness and self-assurance that comes across as unsettling rather than charming, hinting that whatever insecurity used to hold him back might have also been doing some quiet, protective work underneath the surface. Meanwhile, back in the toxic wasteland, Toxic Rick and Toxic Morty are dealing with their own crisis. Rather than accepting their situation, Toxic Rick immediately begins working on a plan to escape and eventually reconnect with the real world, treating the entire ordeal the same way the real Rick treats almost every dangerous situation he ends up in, as a problem to be solved through cleverness, rather than something to simply endure. Toxic Rick eventually finds a way to make contact with the real Rick, and the two of them start negotiating over what should happen next, since both versions understand that keeping two separate copies of the same person walking around indefinitely is not a stable long-term solution. Morty, having enjoyed a taste of life without his usual insecurities, is understandably reluctant to give that version of himself up. He briefly moves on from his disastrous date with Jessica by spending time with another girl named Stacy, and things seem to be going well until Rick reveals that he has already been in contact with Toxic Rick and is preparing to merge the two versions of themselves back together. Morty, suspicious that Toxic Rick might not be entirely honest about his true intentions, decides to resist the plan, and this suspicion turns out to be justified. Toxic Rick's real goal is not a fair mutual exchange. He intends to trick the real Rick and Morty into ending up trapped in the toxic wasteland permanently, allowing Toxic Rick and Toxic Morty to simply take their place in the real world instead. The plan very nearly works. During the attempted transfer, Stacy ends up accidentally taking Morty's place and gets pulled into the toxic dimension instead of him, an unintended consequence of the swap going wrong at the last second. Realizing his original plan has fallen apart, Toxic Rick shifts to a much more drastic solution. Since he cannot send the real Rick into the toxic wasteland the way he originally planned, he decides to bring the toxic wasteland to Earth instead, using a large structure known as a moonlight tower to spread his own corrupted influence across the entire planet, turning every single person on Earth into a toxic version of themselves all at once. The result is total chaos, with the whole population suddenly acting on their worst impulses simultaneously, transforming an already strange situation into something close to a full-scale disaster. This is the point in the episode where Rick's understanding of his own nature becomes the deciding factor in how the entire crisis gets resolved. Facing a worldwide toxic outbreak with no easy way to reverse it, Rick comes up with a plan built entirely on a specific insight about himself, one confirmed directly by how the episode's own internal logic plays out. Rick shoots Toxic Morty with poison, then tells Toxic Rick that the only way to save Morty is for the two versions of Rick to merge back together immediately. Toxic Rick, who has spent the episode acting far more ruthless and self-serving than the ordinary version of Rick usually appears on the surface, initially calls the bluff, assuming that Rick would never actually risk Morty's life just to force a resolution. Rick raises the stakes by increasing the poison dose, and Toxic Rick finally gives in, agreeing to merge rather than let Toxic Morty die. The reason this plan works at all is the real proof at the center of this entire episode. Rick's strategy depends entirely on his own private understanding that he genuinely cares about Morty on a deep level, something Rick apparently views as a personal weakness rather than something to be proud of. If that affection had been treated as a flaw the toxic detox machine successfully filtered out, Toxic Rick would have had no reason to care whether Toxic Morty lived or died, and the entire plan to force a merger would have collapsed instantly. Instead, Toxic Rick's willingness to sacrifice his own freedom and give up his separate existence rather than let harm come to Toxic Morty proves that this affection was never something the spa's machine could actually remove in the first place. It is baked so deeply into who Rick fundamentally is that even the darkest, most self-interested version of him still carries it intact. This detail matters far more than it might seem on the surface. Rick has spent years across the entire series presenting himself as someone who treats emotional attachment as a liability, someone who avoids therapy, avoids vulnerability, and avoids admitting that closeness with another person means anything real to him. Underneath all of that performance, this episode proves, almost as a side effect of solving an unrelated crisis, that Rick's own private assessment of himself, that his love for Morty represents a weakness buried somewhere inside his personality, is completely accurate. He is not imagining a flaw that does not exist. He correctly identified something real and specific about his own emotional makeup, accurate enough that he could use that exact insight with full confidence as the deciding factor in a plan to save the entire planet from disaster. Once Rick and Toxic Rick merge back together, the effects of the worldwide toxic outbreak reverse almost immediately, restoring Earth and its population back to normal, though most people are left with only fragmented, confusing memories of having briefly experienced an improved, unrestrained version of themselves during the chaos. Rick, now whole again, pushes hard for Morty to accept the same kind of full merger, arguing that a person's flaws and their better qualities are simply too tangled together to be separated cleanly without causing exactly the kind of damage the entire ordeal just proved was possible. Morty, however, is not ready to let go of the confident version of himself so easily, and instead of merging back right away, he runs off, leaving his toxic counterpart to live independently for a while. Several weeks later, Clean Morty turns up living in New York City, working as a highly successful stockbroker, entirely unburdened by the guilt, self-doubt, and moral hesitation that once defined the ordinary version of him. Rick eventually tracks him down, determined to force the reunion Morty has been avoiding, and manages to reintroduce the missing toxic half back into him using a makeshift device built specifically for the job. The reunited Morty returns to his usual self, insecurities and all, closing out the episode with the same basic personality he had before any of this ever started, just with a far more complicated understanding of what exactly gets left behind when someone tries to remove the uncomfortable parts of who they are. What makes this episode particularly effective, as proof of something Rick already believed about himself, is how little effort the show puts into making that proof feel like a dramatic revelation. Rick never delivers a big speech about loving Morty, and he never directly explains to anyone why he expects Toxic Rick's affection for Toxic Morty to be strong enough to force a surrender. He simply acts on the assumption quietly, confident enough in his own self-knowledge that the plan barely needs justification at all within the episode itself. The confirmation comes purely through Toxic Rick's actions, not through any speech acknowledging the truth out loud, which fits perfectly with how Rick handles nearly every emotional truth about himself throughout the entire series. He rarely says the difficult thing directly. He simply builds his plans around already knowing it and lets the results speak for themselves. There is also a quieter, more uncomfortable lesson buried inside the entire premise of the episode, one that goes beyond just Rick and Morty individually. The spa's detox machine promised something appealing on the surface, a way to remove the parts of yourself that cause pain, embarrassment, or trouble, leaving behind something cleaner and easier to manage. What actually happens instead is that those removed parts do not simply vanish. They become something separate, dangerous, and fully capable of causing just as much destruction as they ever did, while still attached to the original person, if not more, once they are given room to act without any of the restraint the rest of a person's personality normally provides. Rick's understanding that his own flaws and his own affection for Morty are too deeply connected to be cleanly separated turns out to describe something true about people in general, not just about him specifically, even though the show never states that wider point directly out loud. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same idea, that trying to cleanly separate the good from the bad in any complicated system rarely works out the way anyone hopes, comes back again soon after, except the next time it plays out on a much larger scale, inside an entire society built entirely out of versions of Rick himself, where the attempt to create order and fairness among countless copies of the same person collapses in a way that says even more about what happens when power gets organized rather than simply inherited. Section 09. The Council of Ricks. Rick Sanchez was once offered a permanent seat inside a government built entirely by and for versions of himself, and he turned it down flat, calling the entire idea hypocritical before it ever had a chance to prove him wrong. Years later, after that same government tries to have him killed and ends up destroyed in the fallout, its replacement collapses into exactly the kind of corruption Rick predicted from the very beginning, all the way up to a secret council pulling strings behind a fake democracy and a ruthless new leader wiping out anyone who gets in his way. Rick was not in the room for any of this. He did not need to be. His original judgment about what happens when Ricks try to govern other Ricks turns out to hold up perfectly, even from a distance. The story of this judgment actually begins long before the episode most closely tied to it. The Citadel, a hidden interdimensional society built and populated entirely by different versions of Rick and Morty from across the multiverse, was first introduced earlier in the show as a kind of shared refuge, a place where countless Ricks could band together for protection against outside threats like the Galactic Federation. At some point during its early formation, Rick C-137, the version of Rick the show follows most closely, was offered a spot on the ruling body that would come to be known as the Council of Ricks. He refused, and his stated reason for refusing was simple and pointed. He considered it hypocritical for a group of Ricks, people who pride themselves on rejecting authority and government control, to turn around and build their own government purely to hide from everyone else's. That refusal marked him as a rogue in the eyes of the council, but it also planted the seed for everything that eventually followed. This early rejection matters enormously once you look at what the Council of Ricks actually becomes. Despite existing to protect Ricks from outside threats, the Council itself grows into exactly the kind of centralized authority Rick warned against from the start, made up of a small handful of powerful Ricks making decisions on behalf of an entire society that claims to value independence above almost everything else. The contradiction Rick pointed to years earlier, a society built around distrust of government somehow constructing its own government anyway, never actually gets resolved. It simply gets buried under the daily operation of the Citadel, at least until the entire structure comes crashing down. That collapse happens in an episode called The Rick Shank Redemption, which aired in April of 2017 as the first episode of Season 3. In that story, after Rick C-137 is captured by the Galactic Federation, the Council of Ricks orders an assassination attempt against him rather than working to secure his release, and members of the Citadel's militia also end up capturing his own Morty and Summer during a rescue attempt gone wrong. Rick, faced with a government of his own copies actively trying to have him killed while holding his family hostage, responds with total, devastating force. He infiltrates the Citadel, teleports the entire station directly into a Galactic Federation prison, and uses the resulting chaos to kill every member of the Council of Ricks while also destroying the Galactic Federation's economic system from the inside. Both organizations end up gutted in the process, and the Citadel itself is left in ruins. What makes this moment more than just a straightforward revenge story is how directly it connects back to Rick's original objection to the Council's existence in the first place. He did not simply dislike being controlled by other Ricks out of pure stubbornness. He specifically identified, long before any of this violence occurred, that a governing body built by people who reject government was always going to be an unstable, self-contradicting arrangement, one likely to turn corrupt or hostile given enough time and enough power concentrated in too few hands. The council's decision to try to assassinate him rather than negotiate or protect him, despite him being one of their own, plays out as exactly the kind of betrayal his original skepticism anticipated. The story does not end with the council's destruction, though. In the aftermath, the Citadel slowly rebuilds itself, and this rebuilding process becomes the focus of a later episode called The Ricklantis Mix-Up, which aired in September of 2017 as the 7th episode of Season 3. This episode barely features Rick C-137 or his own Morty at all, since the two of them are off having a separate, self-contained adventure in Atlantis for almost the entire runtime. Instead, the episode shifts its focus entirely toward the Citadel itself, showing what has happened to that society in the time since Rick tore its original government apart. With the Council of Ricks gone, the Citadel transitions into what is presented as a democratic system, complete with an open presidential election meant to give both Ricks and Mortys a voice in how their society is run going forward. On the surface, this looks like exactly the kind of correction Rick's original criticism might have called for, replacing a closed, hypocritical council with a system built on actual public participation. The episode spends its runtime following several different threads inside this newly democratic citadel, including a corrupt police partnership between an idealistic new Rick officer and a bitter, dishonest Morty veteran, a struggling factory worker, Rick trying to survive inside an economy that treats him as disposable, and a political campaign built around a charismatic Morty candidate running for president against a field of Rick opponents. The campaign storyline ends up being the thread that reveals the true nature of this so-called democracy most clearly. The Morty candidate at the center of the election wins over crowds during a debate, building genuine public support, but the process around him is riddled with manipulation from the very beginning. His own campaign manager, another Morty, gets fired abruptly and later approached by a mysterious investigator who hands over secret files exposing something troubling about the candidate. That campaign manager eventually attempts to confront and shoot the candidate directly at a public rally. The candidate survives the attempt and goes on to win the election, becoming the first democratically elected president of the Citadel. But the campaign manager who tried to stop him does not survive much longer, quietly executed shortly afterward by agents working behind the scenes. Once the new Morty president settles into power, the episode reveals the deepest layer of the deception running underneath this entire supposedly democratic system. Behind the public-facing government sits a hidden shadow council of Ricks, the true source of power in the Citadel all along, treating the elected president as little more than a puppet meant to give ordinary citizens the illusion of having a voice, while the real decisions continue to be made by a small, secretive group of powerful Ricks working outside of public view. This detail confirms, almost point for point, the exact concern buried inside Rick's original refusal to join the first council years earlier. Even after the old, openly hypocritical government gets destroyed and replaced with something that presents itself as fair and representative, the same basic pattern reasserts itself almost immediately, just hidden one layer deeper than before. The new president, however, turns out to have no intention of playing along as anyone's puppet. In a swift and brutal move, he gathers the members of the Shadow Council together, confirms that they consider him nothing more than a figurehead installed to maintain their real authority, and then has every one of them killed on the spot, seizing full, unquestioned control of the Citadel for himself. It is later confirmed, through documents that surface after the fact, that this new president is not simply an ordinary Morty who happened to win a fair election. He is revealed to be the same dangerous figure introduced earlier in the show's run, a version of Morty already established elsewhere in the series as being far more calculating and ruthless than any typical Morty ever shown before. This ending closes the loop on Rick's original judgment in a particularly sharp way. The very first attempt at Rick-led government collapsed because a small council of powerful Ricks used their authority to move against one of their own. The supposedly improved democratic replacement collapses just as quickly, not because voters made a bad choice at the ballot box, but because a hidden council of Ricks was manipulating the entire process behind the scenes from the start, only to be violently swept aside by someone even more ruthless than they were. Every attempt to build a stable, fair system of government inside a society made up entirely of Ricks, and eventually Morty's as well, ends the same way, with power concentrating into fewer and fewer hands until it finally lands with whoever is willing to go the furthest to seize and hold on to it. Rick himself is barely present for any of this unfolding disaster, appearing only briefly at the very start and end of the episode as he heads off to Atlantis with his own Morty, seemingly unconcerned with whatever is happening back at the Citadel. In a short scene after the episode's main events, Morty asks him whether the Citadel's return to relevance concerns him at all, and Rick brushes the question off, confident that whatever is happening there will have no real bearing on their own lives going forward. Given how much later chapters of the show eventually complicate that confidence, it is worth noting that Rick's dismissiveness here is not really the point of this particular story. The point is that his original, years-old objection to the very idea of Ricks governing themselves through any centralized structure keeps proving accurate, over and over, no matter how many times the system gets rebuilt or renamed. Whether he personally chooses to pay attention to the outcome or not, the outcome keeps arriving exactly the way his early refusal predicted it would. There is a certain grim consistency running underneath this entire chain of events that connects directly back to something the show keeps circling around whenever it deals with groups of Ricks trying to organize themselves into anything resembling order. Individual Ricks, left to operate on their own, tend to be chaotic and self-interested, but at least that chaos is honest about what it is. The moment those same individuals attempt to formalize their power into a shared government, whether through an openly ruling council or through a democracy secretly steered from behind closed doors, the result tends to curdle into something far more dangerous than simple chaos ever was. Rick saw that pattern coming before the first Council of Ricks even had a chance to fully form, and nothing that happens across the destruction of that council or the corruption of its replacement ever manages to prove him wrong. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same warning about concentrated power finding its way into the wrong hands eventually reaches its most serious and far-reaching confirmation later in the show's run, when the very same dangerous figure who seized control of the Citadel in this episode turns out to be connected to a threat far larger than any single government, one tied directly to the deepest, most carefully guarded secret Rick has been protecting about the structure of reality itself. Section 10. The Evil Morty Confirmation. Rick Sanchez looks across a dinner table at the newly elected leader of an entire interdimensional society and recognizes him instantly, not because of anything about his appearance, but because of one small detail buried in Rick's memory from years earlier. This particular Morty was once the only version of Morty who ever managed to hack into Rick's own portal gun. That single fact is enough for Rick to know exactly who he is really sitting across from, and it confirms something Rick has quietly suspected since the very first time this Morty crossed his path. Some Mortys are simply not like the others, and this one has been playing a longer, more dangerous game than almost anyone in the entire multiverse realized. The story of this particular Morty begins all the way back in an episode called Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, which aired in April of 2014 as the 10th episode of Season 1. In that story, a scarred, dangerous version of Rick, along with a Morty wearing a distinctive eye patch, attacks and kills an alternate timeline's Rick before kidnapping that timeline's Morty. Rick C-137, the version of Rick the show follows most closely, gets pulled into the fallout of this attack and finds himself framed for the murders of 27 different Ricks across the multiverse. Taken into custody by a newly introduced Council of Ricks, operating out of a hidden interdimensional base called the Citadel. Inside this base, Morty gets a first-hand look at how differently the Ricks treat Mortys in general, discovering that many versions of himself are treated as replaceable, disposable, and largely interchangeable, existing mostly to serve whichever Rick happens to be paired with them. The scarred, violent Rick from the opening scene eventually captures Rick C-137 with the intention of downloading the contents of his mind directly, but the plan falls apart once Morty organizes a rebellion among a group of captured Mortys being held prisoner nearby, freeing Rick before the download can be completed. In the aftermath, several Ricks from the Council examine the body of the defeated scarred Rick and discover something nobody expected. That version of Rick was never actually operating independently at all. He was being controlled the entire time through a hidden transmitter concealed inside the eye patch worn by his own Morty, meaning the real mastermind behind the entire operation. The murders, the kidnapping, and the attempt to steal Rick C-137's memories was the quiet, unassuming Morty standing nearby the whole time, not the more obviously threatening Rick everyone had been focused on. This reveal matters enormously for understanding everything that follows, because it establishes something the show rarely repeats about any other Morty across its entire run. Nearly every other version of Morty introduced throughout the series, no matter how different their circumstances or personalities might be, ends up treated by the story as fundamentally similar underneath the surface, largely interchangeable with any other Morty a given Rick happens to be paired with. This one specific Morty breaks that pattern completely. He is shown, right from his very first appearance, to be capable of long-term deception, willing to let an entire violent scheme run through a puppet while staying hidden and unsuspected the whole time, and skilled enough with technology to hack directly into Rick's own portal gun, something the show does not suggest any other Morty has managed to do. Once the truth comes out at the end of that first episode, this particular Morty simply disappears into the crowd, destroying the evidence that could identify him and slipping away disguised as just another rescued Morty among the group Rick's own grandson helped free. Years pass within the show's own timeline before this same Morty resurfaces in any meaningful way, though his influence never actually goes away in the meantime. He becomes the hidden force behind an election inside the rebuilt Citadel, eventually revealed to be manipulating an entire supposedly democratic government from behind the scenes before seizing full control and eliminating anyone standing in his way, events already covered in detail elsewhere. What matters for this final piece of the story is what happens once this same figure, now established as president of the Citadel, finally sits down face-to-face with Rick C-137 again, years after their first, far more chaotic encounter. That reunion takes place in an episode called Rick Mirai Jack, which aired in September of 2021 as the 10th and final episode of Season 5. In this story, President Morty invites Rick and his own grandson Morty to have dinner together inside the Citadel, and Rick recognizes exactly who he is dealing with the moment he lays eyes on him. He does not need a long explanation or a dramatic unveiling. He simply remembers, clearly and specifically, that this is the only Morty who ever managed to hack his portal gun, a detail small enough that most people would have forgotten it entirely, but significant enough that Rick apparently never stopped keeping track of it. This single memory is the clearest possible sign of how differently Rick treats this particular individual compared to how carelessly he treats almost every other Morty across the entire series. He does not view this Morty as replaceable or interchangeable. He views him as a specific, ongoing threat, one worth remembering years after their first and only real encounter. During the dinner, President Morty makes his true request clear. He asks Rick directly to explain how to bring down something called the Central Finite Curve, a massive barrier constructed by the Ricks of the Citadel that separates every universe in which Rick happens to be the smartest being around from the rest of the far larger multiverse existing outside of it. According to President Morty's own explanation, this curve does not simply protect the Ricks trapped within it. It also functions as a kind of cage for every Morty born into one of those universes, locking each of them into a life defined entirely by being paired with and controlled by a version of Rick they never chose and cannot escape. Rick refuses to give up the information needed to break through this barrier, but that refusal does not stop President Morty from having already spent a considerable amount of time and effort finding another way to get what he needs. It turns out that years earlier, during that very first encounter back in Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, this Morty had partially succeeded in downloading pieces of Rick's memory before the plan was interrupted, and the fragments he managed to obtain back then ended up being enough, once combined with additional research over the following years, to eventually reconstruct the technical schematics needed to punch a hole through the Central Finite Curve entirely. What looked, at the time, like a failed scheme that Rick and Morty successfully stopped, turns out to have quietly succeeded just enough to set an entire multi-year plan into motion, one that would not fully reveal its true purpose until this final confrontation years later. The method President Morty ultimately uses to power his escape adds a genuinely disturbing layer to everything the audience has learned about the Citadel across the show's run. In order to generate enough energy to break through the barrier, he draws on a program called Operation Phoenix, revealed to be a system responsible for breeding and mass-producing Mortys within the Citadel, treating them as a resource to be harvested rather than as individuals deserving any kind of protection. Countless Ricks and Mortys end up rerouted into this system and consumed to fuel the device President Morty needs. An outcome that confirms, in the most horrifying way possible, exactly the kind of disposable treatment of Mortis that Rick's own grandson first noticed with quiet discomfort all the way back during his very first visit to the Citadel years earlier. As chaos spreads through the Citadel during this final confrontation, President Morty has every loudspeaker in the station repeat a single command, ordering everyone to stay exactly where they are. Naturally, most of the Ricks and Mortys living there attempt to flee instead, only to be killed instantly when their portal guns, secretly tampered with in advance, send them straight into hostile, deadly dimensions rather than to safety. Rick and his own Morty manage to survive this chaos and eventually make their way out of the Citadel as it collapses into disorder around them, narrowly escaping with their lives while President Morty completes his plan uninterrupted. In the end, President Morty succeeds completely. Using the stolen schematics and the horrifying resources drawn from Operation Phoenix, he overcharges the Citadel's dimensional drive and tears open a passage through the central finite curve, escaping into the far larger multiverse that exists beyond it, a region completely free of the specific structure that has kept every version of Rick positioned as the most capable, most dominant figure in his own small corner of reality. According to his own explanation during the dinner conversation, what makes him different from every other Morty trapped inside that same barrier is not some unique cruelty or special darkness. It is simply that he grew tired of the arrangement Rick's built for Mortys everywhere, tired enough to spend years quietly working toward an escape that no other Morty, as far as the show has shown, has ever managed to pull off. This final piece of the story confirms something about Rick's own judgment that stretches all the way back to their very first meeting years earlier. From that first encounter onward, Rick treated this specific Morty as fundamentally different from the enormous number of other Mortys he has met, worked with, replaced, or ignored throughout the series. He did not simply forget about a strange, unsettling incident once it appeared to be resolved. He carried the memory of it forward for years, recognizing the exact same individual the instant they crossed paths again, based on a detail small enough that almost anyone else would have let it slip away entirely. That instinct, that this one Morty deserved to be remembered and watched rather than dismissed the way Rick dismisses nearly everyone else, turns out to be entirely justified by the sheer scale of what this Morty was quietly building toward the entire time. There is something worth sitting with in how differently the show treats this single relationship compared to almost every other interaction Rick has across the entire series. Rick famously treats most people, including most versions of his own family, with a kind of detached indifference, assuming that anyone or anything can eventually be replaced by some equivalent version from another dimension. His attention toward this one particular Morty breaks that pattern completely, and by the end of Rick Mirai Jack, it becomes clear exactly why. This was never simply another version of his grandson. This was the one individual across the entire infinite multiverse who managed to outthink, outweight, and ultimately outmaneuver a man who has spent his entire existence assuming he was always the smartest person in any room he walked into. Taken together, these 10 moments trace something consistent underneath all of Rick Sanchez's arrogance, cruelty, and chaos. His self-assessment in a therapist's office held up. His suspicion of a stranger claiming to be harmless turned out to be earned. His read on a team of supposed heroes matched exactly what they turned out to be underneath their costumes. His understanding of his own flaws, his own biases, and his own blind spots kept proving accurate long after the moment he first stated them, whether anyone around him wanted to believe it or not. Being right about people and about danger never made Rick a better person across any of these stories, and it never should be mistaken for that. It simply confirmed, again and again, that underneath every joke, every drink, and every dismissive shrug, Rick usually already understood exactly what he was looking at before anyone else in the room was ready to see it too. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.